Hello, Hallie. I apologize. Somehow I have misplaced the original video that I recorded of observations on your 5 characteristics. So I'm gonna remake one for you here. So we'll jump right into it. We'll go through it one more time. It'll be the first time that you see it, but I apologize once again for that. But we'll get it taken care of, right? So let's take a look, see what we have. So the first thing that I do, if you've taken a look at any of the other students' work, you'll note that I take a look at like an overview first. I kind of go through all of the postings first and just sort of look at what you're putting up there, whether you have all of the elements up there, whether they're in the particular order, the sequence, the DITCH, direction, intensity, temperature, contrast, hardness. It does create that clever acronym. It's helpful so that you can remember the 5 characteristics, but it's also an indicator of the general order in which you would address them, at least particularly the direction. Direction is always going to be the first of the 5 characteristics that you address in lighting for photography. Where the key light goes, that's going to be the first thing you think about. Even if you're outside and the sun is your key light, that's what you're considering. Where is the sun in relationship to where I am and where the subject is? How do I position myself? And if it's the sun, you can't reposition the sun. You can wait for the sun to move and stuff like that. So direction is always first, and so therefore we would want to have that first in the order. Then we would look at intensity and all the others, and you could almost think that intensity, temperature, contrast, hardness, those other 4 kind of happen a little bit at the same time because you're sort of considering them in whatever level they need to be considered, kind of all a little bit at the same time, but direction's always going to be first. So, well, I see what we have here is of course intensity first, and then we have contrast, then temperature, then hardness, and then direction last. Now, you've got them all in there, so that's not it. It's not like you missed something, but I do want to emphasize direction is the most vital of them. You would always introduce direction first. So I'm not going to ding you, like crazy on that. I will clarify that for the next session, for the next group, to make sure that it's clear that it's important that direction is the first thing you post, because that should be at the top. But you have them all up there. Also, it appears that you have everything labeled. That's good. Also, exposure-wise, whether the images are light or too dark, nothing looks out of order. Overexposed, when I say overexposed, that means too bright. When I say underexposed, that means too dark. Underexposed means not enough light, too dark. Overexposed means too much light, too bright. So that's basic terminology that you'll hear me talk about, or other photographers. You'll hear me say that throughout the semester. Composition-wise, when I say composition, we're talking about the dynamic use of the space. Even though this isn't a compositional class, I still want you to use the principles and frameworks that you learn in your 2-dimensional design classes and your drawing classes and the others, because they apply to photography. Now, there are other compositional considerations as well as you grow in creating 2-dimensional compositions. Photography is unique that it is subtractive. You have the whole world in front of you and you start to frame it within the viewfinder, unlike maybe drawing, where you start off with a blank piece of paper or surface and you start making marks. With photography, you reduce, so you're kind of framing things. With that, what's important is that with your compositions, you address the entire frame, the entire space. So something like this is, it's a good job what you're doing, because you are addressing from side to side. Even though this is a dark space, it is a shape that you're creating with the light. From top to bottom, you're allowing things to run off. So you are identifying that this entire shape is what you are framing, rather than maybe just a small space, which a lot of new photographers will do. They'll identify a small area, maybe the middle, They might even just be focusing on or looking at the area that they have sharp or that they're focusing on. That happens in drawing, right? You're looking at the space because you're trying to render it. You're looking at one location of your still life or something, and then you're trying to draw it. So you're really intensely focused on that. And you may not even be paying attention to the garbage can in the background. With photography, the camera is going to see that garbage can in the background. And if it's not part of what you're doing, you'll need to actively be removing it, actively be cropping it out or doing something to get rid of it. It looks like, at least in some of these first ones, you're doing a good job of addressing the entire plane and not letting things that are extraneous, things that are in the background, get in your way. Another thing that looks like you're doing fairly well is observing compositions rather than sort of controlling and manipulating the compositions. You know, it can get away from you here. I mean, something like this does feel a little bit forced, where it looks like you're trying to create something there. So, you know, it could go a little too far. And I think it's good you're experimenting with stuff like this. This is a good thing. I want encourage you to keep doing this, but when you get to something like this, it does feel a little bit forced, you know, as opposed to something like even this, although it has the same feel to it, you know, the bottle's leaning, it doesn't feel contrived. It doesn't feel like you did it. It feels like maybe that could have happened and you found it. There's a big difference between something that feels like you're observing it and then something that feels like you're heavily manipulating it. There's nothing wrong with manipulating it and creating a composition that is definitely controlled. We just want it to feel natural. And so that's something you'll discover. Keep exploring. Not all of them are going to work. That's why we're in this class. That's why we're doing these studies. So again, this is not criticism. This is constructive observation. Just take these notes. I want to point these things out so that you can do something with them. We'll just move back all the way up here to intensity because it looks like you kind of just dropped direction down to the bottom, and we'll kind of move through them that way. Intensity, you're sticking with this strong composition, very minimal in some cases, which is still very good. You're setting up some beautiful rhythms here, which is really nice, Hallie. Very good, because you've got these spaces here. Something like this, you're not just addressing the positive shapes with these bottles, but you're also addressing these spaces in between. I do want to note, however, when we start using two lights, you have the key light. You always still start with just the key light. The key light is the strongest, most powerful light that you use, right? It establishes direction. And as I said before, direction is the most sort of important, if we want to use that word, important aspect of lighting for photography. It establishes a time, it establishes a sort of energy, it establishes a direction of the shadows. It does so many things for us. And so direction is very important. And the key light offers us that direction. When we start to work with intensity via a fill light, we add a fill light. The purpose of the fill light is to well, first of all, bring up the intensity of the light, make everything a little bit brighter. But it is always meant to support the key light, not compete with the key light. It is always, 100% of the time, visibly less intense than the key light. Visibly less intense than the key light, not measurably. Like if you were to measure them with a densitometer and you're like, yeah, technically that's not as bright. No, visibly, if I'm just looking at it, I can say that's definitely darker than this one. The reason it needs to be visibly darker is they can't compete. The fill light always needs to be second fiddle to the fill light needs to be second fiddle to the key. The key light needs to be like, I'm the sun, and the fill light needs to be, okay, I'm just going to help you out a little bit here. So when the fill light approaches the intensity of the key light, you start to get what's called conflict. You get equal sources or intense sources coming from two sides, and you get conflict. That's not contrast. Contrast can be good. Conflict creates this conflicting sort of view, and it creates this unnatural feel to the image. That's what we're getting here. You're using the fill light fairly well. You positioned it in the right spot. I can't tell though, which is brighter visibly. I mean, I can tell which is brighter, but there's an equal balance there. We would want the fill light to be measurably lower than the key light. And so what happens here is you've got equal lights on either side, and it's creating a contrast, an undesirable contrast. So bear that in mind again. And all of this is about lesson, right? All of this is about exploring, figuring stuff out, and then what can we learn from it? This isn't about right or wrong. This isn't about, oh, you're going to get a bad grade. I'm making these observations so that you can go, oh, I get it. That's how it works. I'm all about that. That's what I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in helping you make these discoveries, because once you understand these aspects, they're so powerful. You can do almost anything, and they can translate into your other media, because once you know this kind of lighting principle, you can apply that to painting, because your sense of light in your paintings will take on these characteristics. So that said, you didn't do that to all of them. In some cases, your fill light is appropriate, but in some of those, it does look like your fill light is too close in intensity to the key light. So bear that in mind as you're going. Contrast, that's all about the reflector. And a lot of times, the students will forget the reflector after they've used it for this experiment. And that is a mistake. Carry the reflector with you for the rest of the class. Carry it with you literally and in your mind to use. Actually, the reflector is, in my opinion, and in my experience, a much more useful tool than a fill light. I go to a reflector before I go to a fill light all the time. I go to a reflector first. Can I use a reflector rather than a fill? If I can, then I'll use that first. I use a card rather than turning another light on. I'll use a mirror outside to create an additional sort of luminosity than dragging a light out there to try to work with it. I'll use a silver or a gold reflecting card to bounce beautiful gold light off of wherever the key light is coming from. The other wonderful thing about using a reflector is that issue that I was just talking about before. You know how we always have to have the fill light be lower in intensity than the key light, right? The key light's the strong light, the fill light needs to always be lower than that. Well, you're in control of the fill light, and so you can accidentally make the fill light too bright. That will never happen with a reflector. The reflector is gathering the extra leftover light from the key light, right? You remember my demonstration, the light was sort of passing past the bottles and getting thrown over onto the wall there. And I was like, look at all that wasted light over there. Let's grab it and throw it back into the scene. So I grabbed the card and I bounced it back in there. Well, it's not all of the light. So it's only a small percentage of the light that I was able to grab and throw back into the scene. So I know to a certainty it's never going to be as bright as that key light. So I know always I'm not going to destroy the intensity of the key light. I'm not going to ever compete with the key light. I'm only going to ever help it. So that's why using the reflector and modifying contrast that way, I prefer that, and I would encourage you to explore that in all kinds of wonderful ways, even before considering adding another light to your scene. So with that, this contrast experiment's all about that, exploring the possibilities there. Again, it looks like you're doing a pretty good job there. Your compositions, again, are very strong. You've got a really good sense of rhythm in your compositions. You're establishing this sort of repetition of the bottles where you're using the positive negative space. It's very good. I mean, I think you could probably use some different perspectives, moving the camera up or down. You're using the same point of view quite a bit. So I would say, let's kind of start to move the camera up or down and get a different point of view, not just the same camera angle all the time. In the future, I'm not saying that this is like, this is a get to know you kind of lesson here, right? Getting to know what the expectations are, how things work, and so on. But, explore. The camera is something that you can kind of move around as we get more and more freedom to move. Temperature. We're kind of all over the place with some of these postings. It kind of got away from you a little bit there, but that can easily be corrected. You can correct that in your, actually now, you can just go into the posting and like literally move some of these images around and kind of get it back into an order that makes more sense. Let's go ahead and jump down to hardness. That way you can, and then we'll get back to temperature. Hardness is about the shadows. That is about diffusing the light or not diffusing the light. Again, something that a lot of students forget about after the 5 characteristics. 5 characteristics are the 5 characteristics. Hardness and diffusing light sources is an important part because it's one of the 5 characteristics. Just because it's the last of the 5 doesn't mean it's less important. Direction is vital. Direction is first, but hardness is modifying the key light, the direction. And so that is certainly important. And we want to be able to control the shadows, the nature of the shadows, so that's important. What's the nature of the shadows? Are they soft on the edge or not soft on the edge? It can completely transform the look and feel. On top of that, when we start to create combinations, when we start to use, for instance, a soft key light, and then we add a fill that is hard, no diffusion on it, but very, very minimal. So it is like a 1 to 10 thing. The fill light is like 10% of the key, very low in intensity compared to the key. And it's small too, maybe narrow, and you're just barely kind of adding it in as a little bit of a highlight. You can really get some rich and beautiful combinations that way. Then you start to modify the color balance in those things, and it's amazing how much variety and how much complexity you can add to something that is actually so simple, where you're just using these simple 5 elements, 2 lights maybe, a diffuser or reflector, and you're creating something that has a wealth of richness and variety and tone and all of those kinds of things. This is all about exploring. This is all about understanding what these principles are and kind of getting to know them and how you might be able to apply them to your own photography. And I want this to be your photography. I'm offering you universal principles. These are not things that I made up. These aren't sort of questions for you to go, well, is it so or is it not so? These are so. This is just like, saying, okay, 1 + 1 = 2. Direction is a characteristic of photographic lighting. We don't have to wonder if it is or it isn't. How you use it, however, that is going to be where your visual voice comes into it. And moving forward, we don't let go of these principles. We simply use them in a variety of combinations that suits our objective, what we're trying to communicate. And so I hope that you're able to take what we have learned and move forward into the studio. I look forward to seeing more of your photography as we step forward, and we'll see you in the studio. All right, bye-bye now.